A wealthy man stood motionless, phone pressed to his ear, stunned by the voice on the other end. A voice he didn't recognize. "Daddy, can you come pick me up? My stomach hurts." That one call, less than a minute long, would ripple far beyond that moment, sending shockwaves through a courtroom and uncovering a secret buried for over a decade. Drip, drip. An old pipe leaked steadily overhead, each drop echoing as it hit a stained porcelain sink. The bathroom was still, eerily still, like the air itself had been sucked out long ago. Faded yellow tiles peeled away in dark, mold-covered patches, heavy with years of neglect. Beneath the sink, a young girl sat curled tightly, her small frame pressed into itself for warmth. Her hair was tangled, her thin t-shirt wrinkled and clinging to her skin. Bare feet rested on the icy floor. Slowly, she reached out and lifted the receiver of a dusty rotary phone. The overhead bulb was dead. Only a faint thread of moonlight spilled through a small window, casting a cold glow over her pale, weary face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, lips dry and cracked. She began to dial, each number clicking hollowly in the silence. Her hand trembled as she hovered over the final digit. Then, she pressed it. The phone rang once, then again, a third time. Just as she was about to let go of hope, the line clicked. A voice, a man's voice, calm and unfamiliar, answered, "Hello?" The girl tightened her grip on the receiver, clutching it like it might vanish. "Daddy." A silence followed. Not confusion, not disbelief, just the kind of pause that pulls all the air out of a room. "My stomach hurts," she whispered. "Daddy, please come get me." It began on an unforgiving Tuesday night in October. Outside, the wind slashed through the streets like a blade, and the rain struck windows with the force of gunfire. At exactly 3:17 a.m., a phone rang, not unusual in this line of work, and almost never good news. Detective Morrison was the voice on the other end. His tone was clipped and urgent. He requested immediate presence at the city's children's hospital. Emergency custody case. No other details were given, only that time was of the essence. Upon arrival, the hospital presented its usual mix of antiseptic scent and quiet desperation. In the lobby stood Morrison, visibly shaken. Without ceremony, he explained the situation. A 7-year-old girl had arrived around midnight by ambulance. She was discovered alone in an apartment on Elm Street, severely dehydrated and malnourished. No guardians were present. What made the case unusual, however, was that the child kept asking for her father. There was a problem. Official documents listed the father as unknown. The mother had disappeared 3 years prior. Since then, the child had been passed between distant relatives and foster homes like an unsolvable puzzle. And yet, despite it all, she remained convinced her father would come, if someone would just call him. The girl's name was Nora Elizabeth Hayes. Small, pale, and motionless in the stark hospital bed of room 314. Her dark hair was fanned across the pillow, her tiny body overwhelmed by the sterile white linens. Even in unconsciousness, there was something hauntingly delicate about her. She had repeated one thing before slipping out of consciousness: a phone number, 555. Whitmore. It was traced to Andrew Whitmore, a name that needed no introduction. A powerful real estate mogul, philanthropist, and fiercely private man, Whitmore had not been seen publicly much since his divorce 5 years prior. His estate's protocol was strict. Calls were filtered after 10 p.m. due to frequent claims from strangers hoping to connect themselves to his fortune or name. But this wasn't just any claim. It wasn't coming from a stranger with an agenda. It came from a small girl who lay silent in a hospital bed, holding on to the last thread of hope she had, that someone would call him, and that he would answer. What followed next would unfold not in headlines or press releases, but in quiet moments between breaths, in the spaces between denial and belief. and in the choices made by those who refuse to let one more child fall through the cracks. There are moments in life that split your world in two. Moments that make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loss, and the threads that bind us together. This is the story of one such moment. A midnight call that changed everything. My name is Sarah, and I've been a social worker for 23 years. I've seen enough broken families to fill a cemetery, heard enough lies to stock a library, and witnessed enough pain to drown an ocean. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the case that would haunt me for the rest of my career. It started on a Tuesday night in October. The kind of night where the wind cuts through your jacket like a blade, and the rain sounds like bullets against your window. I was just settling into bed with a cup of chamomile tea when my phone rang. 3:17 a.m. In my line of work, calls at that hour never bring good news. "Sarah, it's Detective Morrison." His voice was tight, strained. "We need you down at Children's Hospital, emergency custody situation." I pulled on my clothes, grabbed my keys, and drove through the empty streets of downtown. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and despair, a combination I knew too well. Morrison was waiting for me in the lobby, his face grim. "7-year-old girl," he said without preamble. "Brought in by ambulance around midnight, severe malnutrition, dehydration. She was found alone in an apartment on Elm Street. But here's the thing, Sarah. She keeps asking for her daddy. Problem is, according to our records, she doesn't have one." "What do you mean?" "Birth certificate lists father as unknown. Mother disappeared 3 years ago. The girl's been bouncing between distant relatives and foster homes ever since. But she's adamant, keeps saying her daddy will come get her if we just call him." I followed Morrison down the sterile hallway, my heels clicking against the linoleum. We stopped outside room 314. Through the small window, I could see her, a tiny figure dwarfed by the hospital bed, dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Even unconscious, she looked fragile, like a bird with broken wings. "What's her name?" I asked. "Nora. Nora Elizabeth Hayes." Something about that name tugged at my memory, but I couldn't place it. "And she gave you a phone number?" Morrison nodded, pulling out his notebook. "She was barely conscious when they brought her in, but she kept repeating it. 55 Whitmore. We ran it through the system. Belongs to Andrew Whitmore." I felt the blood drain from my face. Andrew Whitmore. Even people who didn't follow business news knew that name. Real estate mogul, philanthropist, one of the city's most eligible bachelors. Also known for being intensely private, almost reclusive since his divorce 5 years ago. "Did anyone call him?" I asked. "We tried, got his service. They said he doesn't take calls after 10 p.m. unless it's an emergency." "This seems like an emergency to me." Morrison shrugged. "Apparently, crazy people call claiming to be his long-lost relatives all the time. Security protocol." I stared at the little girl through the window. Something about her face was familiar, though I couldn't place why. "Let me try," I said. "Sometimes these situations require a woman's touch." Back at my office, I sat staring at the phone for a full 10 minutes before dialing. The number rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Whitmore residence. This is James, Mr. Whitmore's personal assistant. How may I help you?" "This is Sarah Chen, Child Protective Services. I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore immediately. It's regarding a medical emergency involving a child." There was a pause. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but Mr. Whitmore is not available. If you'd like to leave a message—" "Listen to me very carefully," I interrupted, letting steel creep into my voice. "There's a 7-year-old girl in the hospital who's been asking for her daddy. She gave us this number. Now, either you wake him up, or I'll have the police do it with a warrant. Your choice." Another pause, longer this time. "Please hold." The minutes stretched like hours. Finally, a different voice came on the line. Deeper, rougher, tinged with sleep and something else. Fear, maybe. "This is Andrew Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm a social worker with Child Protective Services. There's a little girl at Children's Hospital who's been asking for you. Her name is Nora Elizabeth Hayes. Silence. So long I thought the line had gone dead. Mr. Whitmore, are you there? Elizabeth, he whispered, and his voice cracked like thin ice. Oh my God, Elizabeth. Sir, do you know this child? I don't know. Maybe. Where did you say she was? Children's Hospital, room 314. Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, is there any possibility this child could be yours? The silence stretched again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Andrew Whitmore arrived in exactly 18 minutes. I watched him through the hospital lobby's glass doors, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of purpose that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of lives. But as he approached the information desk, I could see something else in his bearing. Vulnerability. Fear. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were expensive but hastily thrown on. A wrinkled dress shirt, pants that didn't quite match, shoes without socks. Mr. Whitmore? I approached him carefully. I'm Sarah Chen. He turned to me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. Recognition mixed with terror. Where is she? Before we go up, I need to ask you some questions. No. His voice was firm. Questions later. I need to see her first. I understood. Sometimes you have to see something to believe it's real. We rode the elevator in silence, the only sound our breathing and the mechanical hum of the building. At room 314, he stopped abruptly. What if? He began, then shook his head. What if she's not mine? What if this is some kind of mistake? Mr. Whitmore, what do you know about Elizabeth Hayes? His face went white. Elizabeth Hayes died 3 years ago. Car accident. I went to the funeral. This child's mother disappeared 3 years ago. Her body was never found. He stared at me, and I watched as the implications hit him like a physical blow. You're saying Elizabeth might still be alive? I'm saying we need to find out the truth, starting with whether or not you're this little girl's father. Andrew pushed open the door to room 314 with trembling hands. The little girl was awake now, sitting up in bed picking at her hospital bracelet. She looked up when we entered, and I watched Andrew's knees nearly buckle. She had his eyes. Not just the color, that distinctive storm gray, but the shape, the way they crinkled slightly at the corners. Her chin had the same stubborn set, her hands the same long, elegant fingers. Are you my daddy? She asked in a voice like cracked glass. Andrew couldn't speak. He stood frozen in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The silence stretched between them, fragile as spider silk. Mommy said you might come someday, Nora continued, her voice getting smaller. She said you had storm eyes just like me. That broke him. Andrew crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside her bed. Storm eyes, he repeated softly. Your mother used to say that about mine. She did. Nora's face lit up with the first smile I'd seen from her. She said lots of things about you. She said you were brave and strong and that you built castles. Buildings, Andrew corrected gently. I build buildings. Same thing, Nora said with the logic only a child possesses. Mommy said you didn't know about me. Is that true? Andrew's face crumpled. Yes, sweetheart. If I had known, I would have come for you a long time ago. I stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, we'll need to do a paternity test to make this official, but she's mine, he said without taking his eyes off Nora. I can see Elizabeth in every line of her face. She's mine. Over the next few hours, piece by piece, the story came together. Andrew and Elizabeth had dated for 2 years, lived together for 1. They'd talked about marriage, about children, about a future that seemed as solid as the buildings Andrew constructed. But Elizabeth had demons. An alcoholic mother, an abusive stepfather, a string of foster homes that had taught her that love was temporary and trust was dangerous. The closer they got to something real, the more frightened she became. The fight started small, Andrew told me as we sat in the hospital cafeteria at dawn. She'd pick at things. Why was I home late? Who was I talking to on the phone? I thought it was normal relationship stuff. I didn't understand that she was testing me. Testing you how? To see if I'd leave. She was so convinced that everyone would abandon her eventually that she tried to make it happen on her terms. The night she left, she screamed at me for 2 hours about something ridiculous. I can't even remember what. When I finally walked out to cool down, she was gone when I got back. And you never tried to find her? His face twisted with regret. I hired private investigators. Spent more money than I care to admit, but Elizabeth was good at disappearing. She'd had practice. After 6 months, they told me she was probably dead or didn't want to be found. Either way, I got the message. But you went to her funeral. Elizabeth Davis. Different last name, different city. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't seen the obituary by accident. Car accident, they said. Closed casket. He rubbed his face with both hands. I should have known it was fake. Elizabeth was terrified of driving. She never even had a license. The picture became clearer as the day wore on. Elizabeth had faked her own death to disappear completely, but she'd been pregnant when she left. She'd raised Nora alone, moving from city to city, job to job, always looking over her shoulder for threats that existed mostly in her own mind. She got sick, Nora told us when she was feeling stronger. Real sick, with the shaking and the crying. She said the SAD was eating her up from the inside. Depression, probably severe, possibly complicated by addiction issues. Elizabeth had been fighting a losing battle with her own demons, and in the end, the demons won. Where is your mommy now, sweetheart? I asked gently. Nora's face clouded. She went away. Mrs. Patterson next door said she went to heaven, but I think she just got lost. She gets lost sometimes when the SAD comes. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and legal procedures. The paternity test confirmed what we all already knew. Andrew was indeed Nora's biological father. But that was just the beginning of the complicated process of untangling Elizabeth's carefully constructed web of lies. We traced her movements over the past 3 years. She'd used at least 4 different identities, moving Nora from state to state like pieces on a chessboard. Sometimes they'd lived in decent apartments, sometimes in fleabag motels. Elizabeth had worked when she could. Waitressing, house cleaning, anything that paid cash and didn't require too many questions. She was running from something, Detective Morrison told me as we reviewed the files. But I'm starting to think it was all in her head. The truth was simpler and sadder than any of us had imagined. Elizabeth Hayes had been running from her own psychological wounds, dragging her daughter through a nomadic existence that had finally caught up with them. 3 weeks before Nora ended up in the hospital, Elizabeth had disappeared again. But this time, she hadn't come back. We found her in a morgue in Phoenix, listed as Jane Doe, NARP 47. Overdose of prescription medications, probably accidental but possibly intentional. She'd been dead for 18 days when we identified her. I had to tell Nora. It was one of the hardest conversations of my career. Is Mommy really in heaven now? She asked, sitting in Andrew's lap in the hospital playroom. I think so, sweetheart, I said. I think she's finally at peace. Good, Nora said simply. She was tired of being sad all the time. Getting custody of Nora should have been straightforward. Andrew was her biological father. He had the means to care for her, and she clearly wanted to be with him. But the system doesn't always work the way it should. Elizabeth's sister, Patricia, emerged from nowhere to contest the custody arrangement. She'd never shown any interest in Nora during the 3 years Elizabeth was missing. But suddenly she was convinced that a rich man couldn't possibly be a suitable father. He abandoned Elizabeth when she was pregnant, Patricia argued in court. He spent 7 years living in luxury while his daughter bounced between foster homes. What kind of man does that? The kind who didn't know he had a daughter, I wanted to shout. But family court isn't about logic. It's about what's best for the child, and sometimes that gets lost in the politics and prejudices of the adults involved. The custody hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Nora was found. During that time, she lived in a temporary foster home while Andrew was allowed supervised visits 3 times a week. I watched him during those visits, saw how he struggled to connect with a daughter he'd never known existed. "How do you talk to a 7-year-old?" he asked me after one particularly difficult session where Nora had barely spoken. "Like she's a person," I said. "Tell her about your life. Ask about hers. Don't try so hard to be perfect." It was good advice, but easier said than done. Andrew was used to boardrooms and construction sites, not tea parties and bedtime stories. But gradually, slowly, they began to find their rhythm. He brought her books, classic fairy tales that she devoured like candy. He told her about the buildings he'd constructed, showed her pictures of skyscrapers and shopping centers and hospitals. She told him about life with Elizabeth, about the places they'd lived and the people they'd met. "Mommy said you were a good man who just didn't know how to love the right way," Nora told him one afternoon as they worked on a jigsaw puzzle together. "What do you think?" Andrew asked. Nora studied him with those serious gray eyes. "I think maybe you just didn't get to practice enough." The custody hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning in November. The courtroom was half empty. Just the lawyers, the social workers, Patricia and her husband, Andrew, and me. Nora was in school, unaware that her future was being decided by strangers in black robes. Patricia's lawyer painted Andrew as a cold, calculating businessman who had driven Elizabeth away and was now trying to buy his way into fatherhood. Andrew's lawyer argued for biological rights and demonstrated financial stability. Both sides threw psychologists and character witnesses at each other like weapons. I testified about Nora's emotional state, her obvious attachment to Andrew, her adjustment to the foster care situation. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened impassively to everything. "Ms. Chen," she said when I finished, "in your professional opinion, what would be in the best interest of this child?" I'd been dreading that question because the honest answer was complicated. "Your Honor, Nora needs stability, consistency, and love. She's had precious little of any of those things in her short life. Mr. Whitmore can provide financial security, but more importantly, he's genuinely committed to learning how to be her father. Patricia Hayes seems motivated more by anger than by genuine concern for Nora's welfare. And if Mr. Whitmore proves unable to handle the challenges of single parenthood, then we reassess. But I believe he deserves the chance to try." The hearing dragged on for 2 days. Expert witnesses debated attachment theory and developmental psychology. Financial records were examined. Andrew's housekeeper testified that he'd already converted his home office into a bedroom for Nora, complete with princess wallpaper and a bookshelf full of children's books. Finally, the judge called for closing arguments. Patricia's lawyer was passionate but vague, talking about family connections and traditional values without addressing the fact that Patricia had ignored Nora's existence for years. Andrew's lawyer was more direct. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore didn't know he had a daughter. The moment he learned of her existence, he dropped everything to be with her. He's spent the last 6 weeks learning how to braid hair and make pancakes shaped like animals. He's rearranged his entire life around a little girl he'd never met because she's his daughter and he loves her. Isn't that exactly the kind of father we want for Nora?" The judge retired to consider her decision. We waited for 3 hours. "In the matter of custody for Nora Elizabeth Hayes," the judge began, her voice filling the silent courtroom, "the court has considered all testimony and evidence presented." Andrew sat rigid in his chair, hands clenched in his lap. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I hadn't seen her cry during the entire proceeding. "The court recognizes that this is an unusual situation. A child has been without her biological father not through his choice, but due to circumstances beyond his control. The court also recognizes that Mr. Whitmore has demonstrated genuine commitment to learning how to parent this child." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. However, the judge continued, the court is also concerned about Mr. Whitmore's lack of experience with children and his demanding career schedule. No, I thought. Please, no. Therefore, the court awards primary custody to Mr. Andrew Whitmore, with the provision that Ms. Chen will conduct monthly home visits for the first year to ensure Nora's successful adjustment. Visitation rights are granted to Patricia Hayes, 1 weekend per month and alternating holidays. The relief that flooded through me was so intense, I nearly cried. Andrew's shoulders sagged as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Patricia looked stunned, then angry, but she didn't protest. Mr. Whitmore, the judge said, fixing him with a stern stare, this little girl has been through more trauma in her 7 years than most adults experience in a lifetime. She needs patience, consistency, and professional support. I'm ordering family counseling for both of you, and I want monthly reports on her progress. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. I picked Nora up from school that afternoon to take her to Andrew's house. Her house now. She'd been staying with the Hendersons, a wonderful foster family, but everyone understood this was temporary. Am I really going to live with my daddy? She asked as we drove through the tree-lined streets of Andrew's neighborhood. Yes, sweetheart, for as long as you want. Forever? If that's what you both want, then yes, forever. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Will he teach me to build castles? I think he'd love to. Andrew's house was a sprawling colonial on 3 acres, the kind of place that appeared in magazines about successful people. But when we pulled into the circular driveway, I could see he'd made changes. A swing set sat in the side yard. Flower boxes lined the front porch. A small pink bicycle waited by the front door. Andrew met us on the porch, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of his usual business attire. Welcome home, Nora. She stood on the bottom step, suddenly shy. This was the moment we'd all been working toward, but it was still overwhelming for a 7-year-old girl. Would you like to see your room? Andrew asked. Nora nodded and took his offered hand. I followed them inside, past elegant furniture and expensive artwork, up a curved staircase to the 2nd floor. Andrew stopped at a door decorated with wooden letters spelling out, Nora. I wasn't sure what you'd like, he said as he opened the door. So I got a little bit of everything. The room was perfect. Not over-the-top princess pink, but warm and inviting with pale yellow walls, white furniture, and a reading nook by the window complete with cushions and a basket of books. A dollhouse sat in one corner, and stuffed animals were arranged on the bed. Is this really mine? Nora whispered. All yours, Andrew said. We can change anything you don't like. Nora walked slowly around the room, touching everything with reverent fingers. She stopped at a framed photograph on the nightstand, a picture of Elizabeth, young and smiling, from before the sadness took hold. Mommy, she said softly. I thought you'd want her close, Andrew said. We can put up more pictures if you want. I have some from when we were together. Nora looked up at him with those serious gray eyes. Will you tell me stories about her? The happy stories. Every night, Andrew promised, if you want. I left them there, father and daughter beginning to learn each other, and drove home with tears on my cheeks. My final official visit to the Whitmore house fell on a crisp October afternoon, exactly 1 year after that first midnight phone call. I found Andrew and Nora in the backyard, working on a treehouse together. Sarah, Nora called out, waving from her perch on a wooden platform. She'd grown 3 inches and put on 15 pounds of healthy weight. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a ponytail, and her face had lost that haunted, hollow look. How's the construction project going? I asked. Daddy's teaching me to use real tools, she said proudly, holding up a small hammer. We're building a castle in the sky. Andrew climbed down from the tree, sawdust in his hair and a smile on his face that I'd never seen during those early, difficult months. She's got a natural talent for architecture, he said. Better spatial reasoning than some of my junior associates. And how are things going overall? Good, he said, and I could hear the wonder in his voice. Really good. She starts piano lessons next week, and we're talking about getting a dog. A golden retriever, Nora called down. With floppy ears. We'll see, Andrew said. But I could tell the dog was a done deal. I spent an hour with them, observing their interactions, asking my standard questions. Nora was thriving, excelling in school, making friends, sleeping through the night without nightmares for the first time in her life. Andrew had scaled back his work schedule and learned to braid hair, pack school lunches, and navigate the complex social dynamics of second-grade friendships. There's something I want to show you, Andrew said as Nora ran inside to get lemonade. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a video from her school play last week. The video showed Nora on stage in a blue dress and cardboard crown, reciting lines about being a brave princess who saved her own kingdom. But what caught my attention was the moment after her speech, when she looked out into the audience and waved. "Hi, Daddy," her voice carried clearly through the phone speaker. In the video, I could see Andrew in the front row, beaming with pride, waving back. "She wanted to make sure I was there," he said softly. "Elizabeth used to say that love isn't about grand gestures, it's about showing up." She was right. She was right about a lot of things. I just wish... He trailed off, shaking his head. "You can't change the past, Andrew, but you can honor it by loving Nora the way Elizabeth would have wanted." As I prepared to leave that day, officially closing the case that had consumed so much of my energy over the past year, Nora ran up to me with a drawing. "I made this for you," she said, handing me a crayon masterpiece depicting 3 stick figures standing in front of a house. "That's you, that's me, and that's Daddy. And that's our house where we're happy." I studied the drawing, noting the careful detail. Flowers in the yard, a sun with a smiling face, a tree with what looked suspiciously like a treehouse platform. "It's beautiful, Nora. I'll treasure it always." "Are you going to come visit us anymore?" she asked. "Not officially," I said, "but friends visit friends sometimes, don't they?" Her face lit up. "Yes, you can come for dinner and see my treehouse when it's finished." I'd like that very much. As I drove away from the Whitmore house that afternoon, I thought about all the cases I'd handled over the years. So many of them ended badly. Children placed in less than ideal situations. Families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Systems that failed the people they were meant to protect. But sometimes, just sometimes, the story ends the way it should. Sometimes a midnight call brings a father and daughter together instead of tearing them apart. Sometimes love is enough to overcome the mistakes of the past. That night I filed my final report on the Nora Hayes case. The last line read, "Subject has successfully transitioned to permanent placement with biological father. Case closed with positive outcome." But the real story couldn't be captured in official language. The real story was about a little girl who taught a millionaire how to be a daddy, and a man who proved that it's never too late to become the father you were meant to be. Some stories begin with midnight calls that shatter your world. This one began with a midnight call that put 2 broken pieces back together and made them whole. I received a wedding invitation in the mail on a Tuesday morning in spring. Cream-colored cardstock, elegant script, the kind of stationery that whispered of country clubs and society pages. "Andrew Whitmore and Dr. Rebecca Martinez request the pleasure of your company at their wedding ceremony." I smiled as I read it. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Andrew had been dating Rebecca, a child psychologist who'd helped with Nora's therapy during those first difficult months. They'd fallen in love slowly, carefully, with Nora's enthusiastic approval. At the bottom of the invitation, someone had written a note in purple ink, clearly Nora's handwriting, though much improved from her 7-year-old scrawl. "Dear Sarah, I'm going to be the junior maid of honor. Daddy says you're the reason we found each other, so you have to come. P.S. We got the golden retriever. His name is Castle, and he's the best dog in the world. Love, Nora." RSVP'd, yes, of course. The wedding was beautiful, intimate, held in the garden of Andrew's house with about 50 guests. Nora, now 12 and showing signs of her father's height, walked down the aisle scattering rose petals with the seriousness of someone performing a sacred duty. Her dress was pale pink, her hair adorned with baby's breath, and she glowed with happiness. During the ceremony, when the minister asked who gave the bride away, Rebecca's father stepped forward. But when he asked who supported this union, Nora's voice rang out clear and confident. "I do." The reception was held under twinkling lights strung between the trees. I found myself at a table with other family friends, watching Andrew and Rebecca dance their first dance as husband and wife. Nora sat at the edge of the dance floor with Castle at her feet, both of them watching with rapt attention. "It's a beautiful wedding," said the woman next to me, "and that little girl is just precious. How long have you known the family?" "Since Nora was 7, I said. "I'm the social worker who helped place her with Andrew." "Oh my goodness," the woman exclaimed. "You're Sarah. Nora talks about you all the time. She says you're the one who brought her daddy to find her." "She brought herself to him," I corrected. "I just helped with the paperwork." Later, as the party wound down and guests began to drift away, Nora found me sitting on the porch swing, watching the last of the dancing. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling beside me. At 12, she was all legs and elbows, caught between childhood and adolescence, but her eyes still held that serious quality I remembered from the hospital room. "Thank you for inviting me. It was a beautiful wedding." "Daddy's happy," she said simply. "Really, really happy. And Rebecca's nice. She doesn't try to be my mom, but she cares about me." "That's good, right?" "That's perfect," I assured her. "I still miss Mommy sometimes," Nora continued, her voice getting quieter. "Is that okay?" "Of course it is. Missing someone you love doesn't mean you can't love the people you have now." Nora nodded thoughtfully. "Daddy says love isn't like cake. You don't run out if you give pieces to more people. Your daddy's a wise man. He learned from you." "No, sweetheart, he learned from you." We sat in comfortable silence, watching Andrew and Rebecca slow dance on the patio while Castle supervised from his position by the cake table. "Sarah," Nora said eventually. "Yeah?" "I'm writing a story for my English class, about a girl who gets lost and then gets found. Do you think that's a good story?" "I think that's the best kind of story," I said. "Stories about people finding their way home always are." Nora smiled and leaned against my shoulder. "Good, because I think mine's going to have a happy ending." As I drove home that night, I thought about all the ways a life can change direction. A phone call at 3:17 in the morning. A little girl brave enough to ask for help. A man willing to rearrange his entire world for a daughter he'd never known existed. I thought about Elizabeth, whose demons had robbed her of the chance to see her daughter grow up, but whose love had somehow guided Nora to exactly where she needed to be. I thought about the mysterious ways that families form, not always through blood or law, but through choice and commitment and the daily decision to show up for each other. Most of all, I thought about Nora, no longer the broken little bird I'd met in that hospital room, but a confident, intelligent, deeply loved young woman who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. Some midnight calls bring tragedy, but sometimes, if you're very lucky, they bring miracles disguised as emergencies. Sometimes they bring lost children home to fathers who didn't know they were missing anything until they found it. And sometimes, just sometimes, everyone gets exactly what they need, even if it takes 7 years and a social worker with insomnia to make it happen. You know, some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be whispered in the dark, shared between souls who understand that love and loss are two sides of the same coin. But this story, this one clawed its way out of me, demanding to be heard. So here I am, telling you about the night that changed everything, the night Andrew Whitmore's past came calling. I've been carrying this story for 15 years now, like a stone in my chest. Some nights I wake up and think I hear that phone ringing again, that small voice calling out across the darkness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stories like this, they need to start at the beginning. They need you to understand what love looked like before it got complicated, before it got buried under pride and fear and all the ways we learned to break our own hearts. Let me start where all good stories begin. With love. Real love. The kind that makes you stupid and brave and reckless all at once. I was Elizabeth's best friend, you see. Had been since we were 17, working summer jobs at the local diner, dreaming of bigger lives and better loves. I watched her fall for Andrew like watching someone dive off a cliff. Beautiful and terrifying and inevitable. We met him at Murphy's Bar on a Thursday night in October. Elizabeth had just gotten off her shift at the art supply store, her fingers still stained with paint from helping customers mix colors. She was wearing this vintage dress she'd found at a thrift shop, emerald green with tiny pearl buttons, and her dark hair was twisted up with a pencil holding it in place. She always did that when she was thinking about a painting, used whatever was handy to get her hair out of her eyes. "Let's just have one drink," she'd said, dragging me into that dimly lit bar that smelled of cigarettes and old dreams. "I need to decompress before I go home and pretend to care about my mother's opinions on my life choices." Elizabeth's mother was a real piece of work, the kind of woman who measured success in husband potential and grandchildren produced. She'd been after Elizabeth to find a suitable young man since the day she turned 21, as if love operated on some cosmic deadline. The bar was crowded that night, full of college students and young professionals trying to wash away the taste of another ordinary day. We found a small table near the back, ordered wine that was probably terrible but tasted like possibility in that moment. Elizabeth was telling me about this commissioned piece she was working on, a mural for a local restaurant. When he walked in, Andrew Whitmore wasn't the most handsome man in the room, but he was certainly the most magnetic. He had this presence about him, like he occupied more space than his physical form should have allowed. Dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, eyes that seemed to notice everything, and this way of moving that suggested he knew exactly where he was going, even when he didn't. He was with a group of men in expensive suits, lawyers or businessmen, the kind who talked loud about deals and money and their golf handicaps. But Andrew seemed separate from them somehow, like he was playing a role he hadn't quite grown into yet. "Who is that?" Elizabeth asked, and I knew we were in trouble. I'd known her for 6 years by then, long enough to recognize that particular tone in her voice. It was the same tone she used when she saw a sunset she wanted to paint, or a vintage jacket she couldn't afford, but would somehow find a way to buy. "Trouble," I said, but I was smiling when I said it. "The best kind," she replied. They kept looking at each other across the room, stolen glances that lasted a heartbeat too long, smiles that meant something neither of them was ready to define. It was like watching electricity build in the air before a storm, that moment when you know something's about to happen but you can't quite prepare for it. Finally, Andrew excused himself from his group and walked over to our table. Up close, he was even more compelling. There was something vulnerable in his confidence, like he was daring the world to see through his carefully constructed facade. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of nervousness that made him instantly more human. "But I couldn't help noticing. Are you an artist?" Elizabeth looked down at her paint-stained fingers and laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "It's the way you were looking around the room," Andrew said. "Like you were seeing colors and compositions instead of just people and furniture. My grandmother was an artist. She had that same look. And just like that, they were talking. About art and family and the way light changes everything it touches. I became invisible at that table, watching two people discover they spoke the same language without ever having learned it. Andrew bought us drinks, then dinner at a late-night diner that served the kind of food that tastes better at midnight. Elizabeth sketched on napkins while they talked, her hands moving unconsciously, creating little works of art from their conversation. Andrew watched her draw like other people watch miracles. "You're going to be famous someday," he told her as she sketched his profile on the back of a receipt. Famous artists are usually dead artists, Elizabeth replied. I'd rather be happy and unknown. Why can't you be both? Because the world doesn't work that way. Happiness and art don't play well together. All the great ones were miserable. Maybe the great ones were just looking for love in the wrong places. It sounds cheesy now, 15 years later. But in that moment, it was the most romantic thing either of us had ever heard. Elizabeth stopped drawing and looked at him, really looked at him, and I knew I was witnessing something that would change all our lives. I drove Elizabeth home that night, listening to her replay every moment of the evening. She was glowing, practically vibrating with the kind of energy you only get when you meet someone who makes you believe in possibilities you'd forgotten existed. He's different, she said, staring out the passenger window at the city lights blurring past. Different how? He looks at me like I'm already who I want to become. And who's that? Someone worth loving. I should have been happy for her. Elizabeth deserved love. The real kind. The kind that made you brave instead of small. But something about Andrew worried me, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the expensive watch he wore with his casual clothes, or the way his friends kept checking their phones while he talked to us, like they were used to him disappearing on them. Or maybe it was just that he seemed too good to be true, and in my experience, things that seem too good to be true usually are. But Elizabeth was already gone, already falling, and when your best friend is falling in love, you don't stand in the way. You just hold your breath and hope they land somewhere soft. Andrew called her the next morning, then every morning after that. Within a week, they were inseparable. Within a month, Elizabeth had a key to his apartment. Within 3 months, she'd moved in completely, though she kept her old place just in case, which should have been the first sign that even she knew this was happening too fast. But God, they were beautiful together. Andrew would show up at Elizabeth's art shows, not because he understood her work, but because he understood how much it meant to her. Elizabeth would sit through his business dinners, asking intelligent questions about acquisitions and market trends, making his colleagues remember that there was a world outside their conference rooms. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle neither of them knew they'd been trying to solve. Andrew grounded Elizabeth's artistic chaos, gave her the stability she'd never had growing up with a mother who changed jobs like other people changed clothes. Elizabeth brought color into Andrew's black and white world, taught him that success without joy was just expensive emptiness. I was their witness, their third wheel, their keeper of secrets. I saw Andrew teach Elizabeth to drive his first BMW in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning. Watched him grip the door handle while she practiced parallel parking, his face a mixture of terror and adoration. I witnessed Elizabeth convince Andrew to take a painting class, saw him struggle with brushes and canvas while she tried not to laugh at his complete lack of artistic ability. I'm terrible at this, he said after producing what could generously be called an abstract representation of a tree. You're trying, Elizabeth replied. That's what matters. But it looks like a green explosion. Some of the best art looks like explosions. You just have to find the beauty in the chaos. That was Elizabeth, always finding beauty in chaos, always believing that broken things could be made whole with enough love and patience. It's what made her a good artist, and ultimately, what broke her heart. Because Andrew was changing, becoming something Elizabeth hadn't signed up for. His business was growing faster than anyone had expected. What started as a small tech consulting firm was becoming a major player in corporate acquisitions. Andrew was working longer hours, traveling more, wearing more expensive suits to more important meetings. Success looked good on him, I'll give him that. But it also made him harder somehow, like each new deal added another layer of armor between him and the world. The man who used to bring Elizabeth flowers picked from other people's gardens was now the kind of man who had his assistant send arrangements from high-end florists. He's becoming someone else, Elizabeth told me one evening as we sat in her old apartment, the one she'd kept just in case. She'd been spending more time there lately, claiming she needed space to work, but really just needing space to breathe. People change, I said, though I was worried too. It doesn't mean he loves you less. Doesn't it? When was the last time he really looked at me? Not through me, not around me, but at me. I couldn't answer that, because she was right. Andrew looked at Elizabeth now the way you look at a beautiful piece of furniture, with appreciation but without surprise, like something lovely you'd grown accustomed to owning. The fight started small. Missed dinners because of late meetings, canceled weekend plans because of business trips. Andrew forgetting Elizabeth's art show opening because he was negotiating a deal that couldn't wait. Each disappointment was followed by expensive apologies, jewelry, weekend getaways, promises to do better that lasted until the next crisis demanded his attention. He's trying, I told Elizabeth after a particularly bad week when Andrew had canceled 3 dates in a row. Is he? Or is he just managing me like another item on his to-do list? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. The Andrew who used to stay up all night talking to Elizabeth about her dreams had been replaced by someone who scheduled conversations between conference calls. But Elizabeth loved him. Loved the man he'd been and the man she still believed he could be again. Love makes you stupid that way. Makes you hold on to the ghost of who someone used to be long after they've become someone else entirely. The end began with a fight about a painting. Elizabeth had been commissioned to create a piece for the lobby of Andrew's office building, a mural that would represent growth and innovation and all the corporate buzzwords his marketing team loved. She'd spent weeks on the design, pouring her heart into something that would combine her artistic vision with his professional world. When she showed him the preliminary sketches, Andrew barely glanced at them. "They're nice," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "Just make sure they're not too abstract. The board likes things they can understand." "Too abstract?" Elizabeth's voice was dangerously quiet. "What does that mean?" "You know what I mean. Nothing too artsy." "Artsy? You want me to make art that's not artsy?" "I want you to make something that works for the space. What I want to make is something that means something. Something that says growth doesn't have to mean abandoning beauty. Something that says success and soul can coexist." Andrew finally looked up, and I saw something die in Elizabeth's eyes when she saw his expression. Impatient, dismissive, like she was being unreasonable for wanting her art to have meaning. "Just make something they'll approve, Elizabeth. Please, I don't have time to fight with the board about artistic vision right now. When will you have time? When will any of this be important enough for you to have time? What's that supposed to mean? When was the last time you asked me about my work? Really asked, not just nodded and said, 'That's nice,' while you checked your email. You tolerate my work, you support me financially, which isn't the same thing." The fight escalated from there, touching on every wound their relationship had accumulated over the past year. Andrew accused Elizabeth of being dramatic, of not understanding the pressure he was under. Elizabeth accused Andrew of using his success as an excuse to stop caring about anything that mattered. "I'm building something here," he said. "I'm building a future for us." "What if I don't want the future you're building? What if I want the man I fell in love with instead of the stranger he's become?" "I'm the same person." "No, you're not. The Andrew I fell in love with would have looked at my paintings. He would have seen what I was trying to say instead of worrying about what his board would think. The Andrew you fell in love with was broke and had no responsibilities. The Andrew I fell in love with was happy." That stopped him. For a moment, I think he saw himself through her eyes, saw the man he'd become, and wondered if the price of success had been too high. But then his phone rang, some emergency that couldn't wait, and the moment was lost. Elizabeth moved back to her old apartment that night. "Not permanently," she said, "just until they figured things out. But we both knew that some distances can't be measured in miles, and some separations start long before anyone packs a bag." They tried to fix it. Had dinner twice a week, scheduled like business meetings. Went to couples counseling where they sat in careful chairs and spoke in careful voices about communication and compromise. But you can't schedule love back into existence. Can't negotiate your way back to the person you used to be. And then came the night that changed everything. The night Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. She called me at 2 a.m., her voice strange and hollow. "Can you come over? I need someone here." I found her sitting on the bathroom floor of her apartment, holding a pregnancy test like it might explode. The two pink lines were clear and unmistakable. "How long?" I asked, sitting down beside her. 6 weeks, maybe 7. I wasn't paying attention to dates. We've been so... Does Andrew know? God, no. I just found out myself. She leaned her head against the wall, closed her eyes. "What am I going to do, Sarah? What do you want to do?" "I want to go back in time. I want to be 24 again, sitting in Murphy's bar, watching him walk over to our table for the first time. I want to feel that certainty again, that sense that we were meant to find each other." "You can still have that." "Can I? Look at us, Sarah. We can barely have a conversation without it turning into a fight. How are we supposed to raise a child together?" I didn't have an answer for that. Elizabeth and Andrew were like two people speaking different languages, both fluent in love but unable to find the words that would help them understand each other anymore. Elizabeth spent the next 3 weeks agonizing over when and how to tell him. She practiced the conversation with me, tried different approaches: casual, serious, romantic, practical. Nothing felt right. "Maybe I should wait," she said one evening as we walked through the park where she and Andrew had shared their first kiss. "Until we're in a better place." "When will that be?" "I don't know. Soon. It has to be soon." But soon never came. Instead, Andrew got busier, more distant, more wrapped up in the latest deal that would make or break his company's future. Elizabeth got more scared, more uncertain, more convinced that a baby would be the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. The night she finally told him, she'd planned everything perfectly. His favorite dinner, candles, soft music. The whole romantic arsenal deployed in service of news that would either save them or destroy them completely. I wasn't there, but Elizabeth told me about it later, sitting in my kitchen at 3 a.m. with tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't do it," she said. "I sat there watching him eat, listening to him talk about this merger he was working on, and I realized he wasn't even seeing me. I was just part of the scenery." "So you didn't tell him?" "I tried. I said we needed to talk about something important, and he said, 'Can it wait until tomorrow? I've got an early morning conference call with Tokyo.'" Elizabeth laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "Everything can wait with him now. Everything except business." 2 days later, she tried again. Andrew was leaving for a week-long business trip, and Elizabeth knew she couldn't keep the secret much longer. Her body was starting to change. Subtle shifts that she noticed even if no one else did yet. "Andrew, before you go, I really need to tell you something." He was packing, folding shirts with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to live out of suitcases. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like smoke. Andrew stopped folding, his hands frozen on a tie he'd been about to pack. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "Yes." "How long have you known?" "A few weeks." "A few weeks?" His voice cracked with something that might have been hurt or might have been anger. "You've known for weeks, and you're just telling me now? I was waiting for the right time." "The right time? For this?" And there it was, the word that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. This. Not our baby, or our future, or even a baby. This. Like her pregnancy was a problem to be managed instead of a life they'd created together. "I know the timing isn't perfect," Elizabeth said, her voice getting smaller. "Perfect? Elizabeth, I'm in the middle of the biggest deal of my career. I'm working 18-hour days, traveling constantly. When exactly did you think I'd have time for a baby? People make time for what matters to them." "That's not fair. You know this matters to me." "Do I? Because right now it sounds like I've just presented you with a major inconvenience." Andrew sat down heavily on the bed, his head in his hands. "I need time to process this." "What's to process? I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby. Either you want that or you don't." "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" When Andrew looked up, Elizabeth saw something in his eyes that broke her heart completely. Fear, yes, but also resentment. Like she'd done this to him instead of with him. "I'm not ready for this, Elizabeth. I'm not ready to be a father." "When will you be ready?" "After the next deal, the next promotion, the next milestone you've decided you need to reach before you can have a life." "I don't know, but not now, not like this." Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment, and I think that's when she realized their relationship was already over. Had been over for months, maybe. They'd just been too afraid to admit it. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay? Okay, you're not ready. I understand." "Elizabeth, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. And that's okay. At least now I know where we stand." Andrew left for his business trip the next morning. Elizabeth was gone when he got back. She came to my apartment with 2 suitcases and a heart full of resolve that I could see was already starting to crack around the edges. "I'm leaving town for a while," she said. "I need to think." "Elizabeth, you don't have to run away from this." "I'm not running away. I'm making a choice. Andrew made his choice. Now I'm making mine." "What choice?" "To have this baby on my own. To not force someone to be a father who doesn't want to be one." He was scared. People say things they don't mean when they're scared. He meant it, Sarah. I saw it in his eyes. This baby would be an obligation to him, not a joy. And I won't do that to my child. I tried to talk her out of it. Tried to convince her that she was making a decision based on hurt and fear instead of love. But Elizabeth had that stubborn set to her jaw that I recognized from childhood. The one that meant her mind was made up and nothing I said would change it. "Where will you go?" "I have a cousin in Oregon. She said I could stay with her for a while, help with her kids in exchange for room and board. It'll be good for me, being around children, learning what I need to know. And after the baby's born, I'll figure it out. I always do." Elizabeth left that same day. I drove her to the bus station, helped her carry her suitcases and the few paintings she couldn't bear to leave behind. We stood on the platform, waiting for the Greyhound to Portland, neither of us knowing what to say. "Will you tell him?" I asked finally. "Tell him what?" "Where you've gone, that you're okay." Elizabeth shook her head. "Let him wonder. Let him worry. Maybe it'll remind him what it feels like to lose something important. And if he comes looking for you, he won't. Andrew doesn't chase things he's not sure he wants to catch." The bus arrived with a wheeze of hydraulic brakes and diesel exhaust. Elizabeth hugged me tight, and I felt her trembling despite her brave words. "Take care of yourself," I whispered. "Take care of him," she whispered back. "He's going to need a friend when he realizes what he's lost." I watched the bus disappear into the gray morning, carrying my best friend toward an uncertain future. I didn't know it would be 7 years before I saw her again. I didn't know that the next time we spoke, it would be in a hospital room while she was dying. I didn't know that the brave choice she was making would turn into years of struggle and sacrifice that would ultimately cost her everything. If I'd known any of that, I would have run after that bus. I would have dragged her off and made her fight for the love she deserved instead of running from the fear she couldn't face. But we don't get to know the future when we're living through the present. We just make the best choices we can with the information we have, and hope that love will be enough to see us through whatever comes next. Andrew called me 6 hours after Elizabeth's bus left. "Where is she?" His voice was raw, desperate. "Gone." "Gone where?" "Away." She needed space to think. "About what? About us? About the baby?" "About everything, Andrew. You made it pretty clear that she and the baby weren't priorities for you right now." "I never said that. You didn't have to. Elizabeth heard what you didn't say as clearly as what you did." There was silence on the other end of the line, then a sound that might have been crying or might have been the wind. "I love her, Sarah." "I know you do. But love without action is just a feeling. Elizabeth needed more than your feelings. She needed your presence, your commitment, your partnership. And you gave her your fear instead." "I can fix this. I can find her, talk to her." "She doesn't want to be found right now. She needs time to figure out what she wants her life to look like without you in it." Without me? Sarah, I'm the father of her baby. Are you? Because being a biological contributor and being a father are two very different things. That stopped him cold. When he spoke again, his voice was small, broken. What do I do? You figure out what you really want, and then you decide if you're brave enough to fight for it. But Andrew wasn't a fighter, not when it came to love. He was a negotiator, a deal maker, someone who was used to problems that could be solved with money and influence and carefully crafted contracts. Elizabeth's love wasn't a business deal, and her absence couldn't be negotiated away. He hired private investigators, called hospitals and homeless shelters and every Elizabeth Miller in every phone book he could get his hands on. He flew to Oregon and spent 3 days driving around Portland, showing her picture to strangers who shook their heads and looked at him with pity. But Elizabeth had learned to be invisible during her years of struggling as an artist. She knew how to disappear, how to become just another face in the crowd. And she had something powerful motivating her to stay hidden. The belief that she was protecting her unborn child from a father who saw them as an inconvenience. Months passed. Andrew's business continued to grow, but the success felt hollow now. He moved through his days like a ghost, going through the motions of ambition while his heart remained frozen in that moment when Elizabeth told him she was pregnant, and he failed to respond with joy. He called me every few weeks, asking if I'd heard anything. I always said no, which was the truth. Elizabeth had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The investigators found nothing. The cousin in Oregon claimed she'd never heard of Elizabeth Miller. It was like she'd stepped off that bus into another dimension. Maybe she doesn't want to be found, I told Andrew after 6 months of fruitless searching. She's carrying my child. She's carrying a child whose father told her he wasn't ready to be a parent. There's a difference. I was scared. I said things I didn't mean. Elizabeth doesn't know that. All she knows is that when she needed you most, you let her down. So I'm supposed to just give up. Just let her disappear with my baby. Maybe you're supposed to become the kind of man who deserves to be found. That conversation marked the end of Andrew's active search for Elizabeth. He stopped calling private investigators, stopped flying to random cities based on vague leads. But he didn't stop hoping. He kept Elizabeth's key to his apartment, kept her coffee in his kitchen, kept expecting her to walk through his door at any moment. 2 years after Elizabeth disappeared, the police found her car. Miller's Creek was about 50 miles outside the city, a winding waterway that fed into the larger river system. Elizabeth's Honda Civic was discovered by a fisherman, submerged in about 12 feet of water. The windows rolled down, the interior gutted by time and current. I was the one who had to identify it. Andrew was in Japan on business, and I was still listed as Elizabeth's emergency contact from her old job. I stood by that creek watching the police divers surface again and again, each time empty-handed, and felt something die inside me. No body, the lead detective told me. Could mean she got out before the car went under, or could mean the current carried her downstream. What do you think happened? He shrugged, the casual gesture of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by human tragedy. Car went off the road, maybe hit a patch of ice. Happens more than you'd think on these mountain roads. Question is whether it was an accident. That last word hung between us like a threat. I thought about Elizabeth's state of mind when she left, the way she'd looked when she realized Andrew wasn't going to fight for their relationship. Had she been desperate enough to choose the creek over single motherhood? Had my best friend, the woman who found beauty in everything, decided that some stories were too dark to have happy endings? The official report listed Elizabeth Miller as presumed dead. Drowning victim. Cause of accident undetermined. Case closed. I called Andrew in Tokyo, woke him up in the middle of the night to deliver news that would haunt us both for years. They found her car, I said without preamble. Silence. Then, quietly. And no body, no Elizabeth, no baby. The sound Andrew made wasn't quite human. Part sob, part howl, part prayer to a God he'd never believed in. I held the phone and listened to him break apart, 8,000 miles away and completely alone. "I'm coming home," he said finally. "Andrew, I'm coming home. I should be there. I should. There's nothing you can do here. I should have been there all along." He flew back that same day, went straight to the creek where they'd found the car. I met him there, watched him stare at the dark water like it might give up its secrets if he looked long enough. "She's not dead," he said suddenly. "Andrew, she's not dead, Sarah. I would know. I would feel it if she was gone. The police don't know her like we do. Elizabeth is a survivor. She's too stubborn to die." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe that Elizabeth was somewhere out there, alive and safe, and raising the child Andrew had been too scared to claim. But the creek was deep and cold, and Elizabeth had been carrying more weight than just a pregnancy when she left. Still, Andrew clung to hope like a drowning man clings to driftwood. He refused to hold a memorial service, refused to accept the death certificate, refused to move on in any meaningful way. His business continued to thrive. Money has a way of making itself regardless of the emotional state of its owner. But Andrew became a different person. He sold his penthouse and bought a house in the suburbs, the kind of place where children could ride bikes in the driveway and draw chalk pictures on the sidewalk. He kept Elizabeth's paintings, hung them throughout the house like shrines to a love he'd failed to protect. He learned to cook, as if somewhere in his heart he was still preparing for the day Elizabeth would come home hungry and find him ready to feed her. "She's alive," he told me every time we spoke, which was often in those first years after the accident. "She's out there somewhere, and she's okay. Even if she is, Andrew, she doesn't want to be found. She's made that clear. She will. When she's ready, she'll come home." But the years passed, and Elizabeth didn't come home. Andrew grew older, more successful, more alone. He dated occasionally, careful relationships with appropriate women who understood that his heart was occupied by a ghost. None of them lasted long. How could they? You can't compete with memory, with guilt, with the idealized version of a love that never got the chance to fail or fade. I moved across the country 5 years after Elizabeth's disappearance, took a job in San Francisco, and tried to build a life that wasn't haunted by my best friend's absence. Andrew and I stayed in touch, but the conversations became shorter, more forced. What was there to say? That we were both living in the shadow of someone who might be dead. That we were both waiting for a resolution that might never come. I built a career, bought a condo, even got engaged to a kind man who loved me despite my tendency to stare out windows and wonder what if. David was patient with my ghosts, understanding about the friend I'd lost and the guilt I carried for not saving her somehow. "You can't rescue people from their own choices," he told me one night as we walked along the pier, watching the fog roll in from the Pacific. "You can love them, support them, be there for them, but you can't make their decisions for them." I should have stopped her from leaving. How? By force? By manipulation? That wouldn't have been love, Sarah. That would have been control.